All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name's Hayley Sims. I'm Head of Policy and Participation at the RSA. Really, really pleased to be with you. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Great Room. And for everyone joining us online as well, we've got a really special guest with us today, Layla McCay, next to me here. So Layla is Director of Policy at the NHS Confederation, Executive Lead of the UK's Health and Care LGBTQ Leaders Network, and author of a new book, Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling. In her book, Layla combines her research with personal insights from over 40 prominent LGBTQ trailblazers, from CEOs to ambassadors, and reveals the challenges that LGBTQ people commonly encounter in work environments and provides practical strategies that can help empower LGBTQ people in their careers. Just to say, I've read the book. I pre-ordered it on Kindle. Other e-readers are available, I think. And personally, I found it to be a really brilliant read. It chimed with a lot of my own experiences as a visible queer leader. But also, it offers such rich insights with the sort of breadth and diversity of evidence from the interviews that Layla conducted. So the format for today's session is that Layla's going to give us a bit of an opening give us some opening reflections and introduce some of the key themes of the book, and then we'll have a chance to get deeper into the conversation, and we'll bring you all in. So do get thinking about some questions to have in your pocket. Great. We'll make sure we wrap up at 2. And if you're watching online, please drop questions into the chat as well. And on social media, you can use the hashtag RSA Pride. So without further ado, please welcome Layla McCay.
Hi, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here and see you all today and to tell you a bit about Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling, which, you know, is a book that I didn't necessarily plan to write. It was more that I wanted to read the book, and then when I found that it didn't exist, I decided, why not write it? And here we are. And it all came about after I had lunch with this friend of mine who had once sat on a panel for an interview I was going for a fellowship. And he said, oh, you know, it was funny. During your interview, afterwards, one of the panel members suggested not selecting you because you're gay. And I was shocked. And it was also embarrassing that I was shocked, because we all know that minority groups experience all sorts of discrimination and prejudice, including in things to do with work. But for some reason, I had never really thought about it as affecting me personally. But now that I had been presented with the fact that it genuinely had, I started second-guessing everything. I started thinking about, what about all these other interviews that I didn't get? What about these opportunities at my work that I was given or wasn't given? Did being gay somehow affect all those things too? So then I started to get even more interested and looked up all this data. And I was really fascinated to find that of the 500 CEOs who run Fortune 500 companies, you know, the 500 biggest companies in America, only 4 of them were publicly known to be LGBTQ+. And I looked up their board members, 0.8%. And you might be thinking, is that underrepresentation? Yes. There's not really a good way of knowing exactly how many LGBTQ+ people there are in the world. It kind of depends on people being willing and able to tick boxes on a survey. But, you know, people have made efforts. So, for example, the UK census most recently asked the question, and the answer was 3.7%. Just this year, Gallup in the US asked the question, and they came up with 7.6% of Americans. Probably both of these are underrepresentations, but we don't have that exact information. But what we do know is that these numbers are all bigger than 0.8%. And, you know, looking at it across all sorts of sectors and settings, you see fairly similar patterns. So what is going on? So, as you heard, I combined a bit of desk research with interviewing lots of really fantastic LGBTQ+ senior leaders who've been trailblazers over the last decades. And, you know, I asked them, how did you break through the rainbow ceiling? What was it about you being LGBTQ+ that actually affected you at work and in your opportunities? And do you have any advice for us? So I asked them, and that's what's in the book. And let me share just a few of their answers, get a bit of a feel of the sorts of things that came up. It won't be surprising to hear that one of those things was what affects you before you get anywhere near the workplace, growing up as an LGBTQ+ person. And almost everybody grows up to some extent surrounded by a bit of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. It's in the schools, it's with your friends, it's with your family and your family's friends and the media and the politicians. And you hear this, and it affects you. It affects your self-esteem and your self-confidence. And the research tells us it also affects your aspirations and the decisions that you make about what you're going to do after school and what sort of a job you might look to have. There's a few interesting bits in it. So, for example, growing up knowing you're going to have to come out to somebody, you know that there's the risk of rejection. And it's a very real risk. So, for example, we know that LGBTQ+ people are overrepresented in the homeless population, and that's for this sort of reason. So when you're coming out, you're risking rejection, and many people are experiencing rejection. And it's interesting how that sort of thing that happens in your youth just comes back at unexpected moments when you're engaging with your teams or your managers or, a hiring panel. And also because you know that you're at this extra risk of being rejected from your support structures, whether that's financial or practical or emotional, quite a lot of LGBTQ+ people tend to be a bit more self-sufficient than the majority, just operating in a bit more of an independent way. And that can be really positive in various ways, but you actually see that coming out as well in the workplace when people are just a little bit less likely to look for support and access that support when it might help them in their careers. So childhood is interesting. Another really big theme that came out was, of course, coming out at work, which is a huge thing. And, when I speak to people who are not LGBTQ+, lots of them have said, oh, that's surely a thing of the past. Absolutely not a thing of the past. Spoke to people of all ages, and it is a really big consideration because you know that you're having to be vulnerable and put yourself out there knowing that you could be rejected, knowing that you could experience prejudice and discrimination. But if you don't do it, that's also really bad for you. It's a huge mental and practical burden to maintain the vibe of not being an LGBTQ+ person when you are. You're having to constantly police your outfit, your tone, whether you mention your wife, whether you have a certain gesture. All these things just make you feel exhausted and stressed and inauthentic in your relationships with people. And also just constantly on edge in case somebody does find out and somehow uses that information against you. There are loads of stories in the book of how that happened to people. So really, there's tons of benefit to coming out. And when I spoke to these leaders, so many of them used exactly the same phrase to describe when they did come out, which was, it felt like a weight off my shoulders. They felt that they were able to, be more energetic, be more engaged, participate better, perform better, just have a better time at work. That said, that brings us to the next thing, which is bullying, harassment, and discrimination. And you look at any staff survey, it will generally tell you that people who are out as LGBTQ+ people are more likely to experience all of those things. And there's lots written, of course, about verbal or physical or sexual harassment, all of which tend to be higher. But there's also a lot of, less overt ways in which we end up being discriminated against. So lots of people spoke about conversations they were having with their managers, which were really just, their managers trying to develop them and give them advice. But sometimes that advice really kind of amounted to, could you just be a bit less gay? And, said with good intentions, but at the same time, being super homophobic and really just stripping people of their confidence. And then, of course, there's hiring, firing, and promotion, as you won't be surprised to hear. But lots of the things that inhibit us in that space isn't really anything to do with other people so much as ourselves in that moment. We do a lot of self-censoring. Because we've had discrimination in the past, like other minority groups, we feel a bit anxious about putting ourselves forward sometimes. We feel less confident about it. lots of us have not really had the opportunity to have lots of visible LGBTQ+ role models. So many of us, my sort of age, grew up during Section 28, where being gay or bisexual or trans or whatever it may be could not be discussed in schools. You couldn't look and see any CEO that was, a lesbian like me. That was completely invisible to me. So having that sort of thing really affects your aspirations. And even now, it's actually not that many people to look around and see. And then there's all sorts of other things, like, for example, different ways in which we might be excluded from certain networking opportunities. Foreign travel that might really boost our opportunities at work, but actually is illegal to be LGBTQ+ in that location. Or maybe we want to bring our partner, but they wouldn't be eligible for a work permit, or that sort of thing. And some people are just, you know what? Better the devil you know. I could go for that promotion, but actually I am currently lucky enough to be in a team that is really supportive of me, and I feel like I'm able to be my authentic self. Do I actually want to take the risk of going off somewhere else where that might not be the case? And then the final thing in this list of ways in which we find ourselves not going forward is that quite often managers will judge us slightly differently than they'll judge other people, and are more likely, says the research, to say, you're not quite ready for that promotion. But then, of course, if we do apply, there's all sorts of prejudice and discrimination that meets us along the way, like about a quarter of people in surveys say that they believe that they were not hired or they were fired for a reason that had something to do with their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And there's a really good meta-analysis that's been done that shows that if you mention being LGBTQ+ in your job application, then you're a third less likely to be shortlisted compared to identical other applications. And then, of course, there's all sorts of other things like experiences outside of work and the discrimination that people experience there that affects them in work. So there's all sorts of other things, but I thought it would be interesting to give you some of the advice for managers that came up from these people who had managed to make it through these various obstacles. And probably the main one is, managers, employers, are you genuinely interested in LGBTQ+ inclusion? Like, how much do you right now know about your LGBTQ+ staff in terms of what their experiences are like at work? Their big recommendation is to really make sure you are using your staff survey in a sensible way, breaking it down by these the different types, the L's and the G's, and etc., and analysing them to see what are the differences, where are the areas that people are having worse experience, and what can you do about that. And similarly, looking at this disproportionate underrepresentation in senior roles. If that's the case, then thinking, why is that? And it's not just, on the day of hiring, I made a decision. It's all this other stuff, like I've just been talking about, which is really worth understanding and thinking about. Making sure you've genuinely created a sufficiently safe and respectful environment that people can come out in a safe way if they want to. And of course, you're responsible for all sorts of policies and processes. So thinking about them in terms of what their impacts are on different people. I spoke to lots of people who referred to how much of a sense of value and belonging they got when they needed a particular policy, say a surrogacy policy or a transition policy or whatever that may be. And they looked at their intranet and there it was. Somebody had already thought about it. Somebody valued them enough to anticipate and invest in their needs. There's tons and tons of opportunity in all sorts of policies to do that. And then there's practical stuff. IT is a big one. I quite enjoy the story of somebody tells in the book of how they were on their HR system inputting as requested what their sexual orientation was and going for lesbian. And then it was like, she wasn't allowed to save it until she said what date it started and what date she expected it to finish. But there's all sorts of IT shenanigans that can really be made a bit more inclusive. Somebody else said to me, in terms of these drop-down menus you get when you're selecting things like identity, nothing makes you feel othered like having to tick the other box. I always thought that was quite good. But there's a few other things, like, for example, it's a cliche, but lots of prejudice and discrimination is coming down to lack of knowledge. But we know that, but we're not necessarily acting on it because loads of people described the various types of training and awareness that they got at work and saying, well, it wasn't really that specific for LGBTQ plus people, and I was left a little bit none the wiser. So we know that information, we can act on it. The research says probably the most effective way is personal stories, ideally stories from within the organisation. Then there's talent management. We know that there's all these things that are affecting LGBTQ plus people that are not necessarily the same things that are affecting other members of staff, but we're not really designing talent management pipelines for the most part around those particular considerations. And there's lots of opportunity to do that. And then the fourth and final thing on this little mini list is if you are a manager or a senior leader and you're an LGBTQ plus person, it is probably the most impactful thing that you can do for inclusion in this area is to be publicly, visibly out so that your staff can see you, so that those more junior LGBTQ plus people can look and say, wow, there is a person who is clearly doing well in this organisation. That person is out. They're like me, people like me can succeed here. And it changes people's aspirations, and it's really important. But actually, speaking to lots of those people, they thought that they were out and visible because, they were generally out, their teams knew. But actually, if you work in a big organisation, it's not really the case that people are going to know unless you're a little bit more clear and explicit about it, talking at, all staff meetings or at staff networks or whatever may be appropriate for your location. But lots of people said really overestimated how much people were aware of this. And, the benefits of being that visible role model to other people are so significant that you can really think about how to get the best from what you're trying to do. And I'll finish with a few little snippets of advice from these senior leaders to LGBTQ plus people at earlier stages of our careers. And the first one is, have a good think about what you actually want and what you genuinely would aspire to if there weren't barriers, because we know that we tend to aspire for less than we should. That is part of all of this experience of being an LGBTQ plus person. So be aware if there is imposter syndrome creeping into your thinking, because you're more likely to have that than other people. Spot it, and then you can address it. And then thinking about what might help you. Is it having a mentor? Is it having role models? Is it particular types of training? Be a bit more conscious that being an LGBTQ plus person at work, it's not your whole thing, but it is part of you, and it affects your learning and development and your professional opportunities. So factor it in. Think about how you can make yourself in as good a position as possible to achieve what you're trying to. And surround yourself with supportive peers. So much research says it is really, really beneficial when you're able to talk to people who've had similar experiences to yourself. It's one of the big reasons that staff groups and employee resource groups are so beneficial to people. And then in terms of coming out, you might be swithering, but if you feel safe to do it, I didn't speak to anyone who regretted coming out. They universally told me that it was something that brought positivity to their work experience. They were able to perform better. They were able to have better relationships. They were able to enjoy work more. And then the final thing is that being yourself and doing good work is, the fantastic combination. And if you're occupying yourself worrying about how you need to somehow modify yourself to please other people, that is going to get in the way of you doing good work. But quite a few people raised, we as LGBTQ plus people are not exempt from having our own prejudices. And quite often we'll think, gosh, I'd better disguise some aspect of me because I think that person is likely to have prejudice. And actually, what they said was, you probably overestimate that. Often people will not have that prejudice, and you shouldn't hold yourself back worrying about it, because very often people are incredibly supportive, and we shouldn't go around second-guessing like that. That's just some of the snippets from the book, and I hope you found them interesting. Thank you.
We're not doing very well with the stage choreography, so more I'm not. Thank you so much, Layla. There were so many things that I really loved about your book. I wanted to start with a couple of them, and then, as I say, we'll open it out to questions. The first, a sort of acknowledgement, we were talking before, I really valued that you started with a sort of disclaimer, I suppose, about the use of the word queer, which I've already used today, and I acknowledge that it's quite divisive for some people, and some people don't identify with it. For me, it feels like a very unifying word, and you talk a little bit about the sort of the spectrum of experiences between the LGBTQ plus, etc. So I just wanted to sort of say that for people, and yeah, that feels quite inclusive for me. The second, I wondered if you could kick us off with, I really liked that you spent quite a significant chunk of time thinking about the relative advantages for LGBTQ plus people in the workplace, not just the kind of the suffering and the doom and the gloom, which is important, but I wondered if we could sort of kick off with that, if you could talk us through a little bit about kind of, yeah, what's the brilliant sort of diverse perspectives and experiences that queer people of all variety bring.
Absolutely. And it was a real theme when I was speaking to people. But, you know, I was asking people different questions. I was like, what are the advantages to being LGBTQ plus at work? And people would be like, gosh, I don't know. But then they would think about it. And then the same sorts of themes started to emerge. So one aspect was that by being an LGBTQ plus person, you're exposed to different people and different ways of thinking and different culture. And all of those things just help you to think a little bit more outside the box. That is a diversity advantage, and it enables you to just be a bit more creative in certain situations, because you do have sometimes different ways of thinking about things, different understandings of things, different ways in which you understand something might affect people. And then linked to that, quite a lot of people reflected that actually because they had already essentially failed to conform to the majority or the norm in terms of their sexual orientation or their gender, they felt like it somehow gave them this license to fail to conform in other ways. So they were actually able to just be a little bit more quirky at work, be a little bit more innovative, do those things differently. And they saw that their colleagues actually recognized this and would sometimes comment on it. And when I thought about that, I thought, I wonder whether that's actually something I've experienced too. That's quite interesting. And then there's the experience, more of a sort of management type bonus. So you have this experience of feeling different, feeling separate from other people and worrying about the implications of that. I mean, it's not just LGBTQ plus people who have that. Anyone can have that for all sorts of different reasons. But because you have had that experience, you have a bit more empathy and understanding of what that means and what that's like. So you're potentially just that bit better equipped to help support other people with that. And kind of linked to that, you've spent quite a lot of your life pondering your identity in a way that other people might not. Some people might, but it is generally the case that LGBTQ plus people have had cause to really think about who they are and what that means. And it's given us often quite a lot of emotional intelligence, which can be a genuine asset at work. And then I'll give you one more, which is resilience. I obviously described all these potentially challenging things that some people have experienced, and rejection and discrimination and all those things. And you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. We are here, and one side effect of getting here has been developing that resilience that can be an incredible asset in the workplace. So I would say those were the 5-ish main things that people raised.
Yeah, that really resonates, and I think you and I both work in policy, and that kind of creative problem solving, you know, why is the way we do things? How else could things be? That really resonates in terms of that creativity. I think the resilience point, the sort of shadow side of that, I suppose, relates to your point around the need for mentorship, because you talk in the book about how sort of typically LGBTQ plus people can sort of be in their sort of own independent journey and find it more difficult to ask for support because they're used to having to sort of be alone and get through that that difficult environment. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Definitely. And it's so interesting, isn't it? Because, mentor is one of the classic, mentors and sponsors, it's like the classic suggestion that people will often get in terms of how to further their careers. But there is all this evidence that we are much less likely to have a mentor or a sponsor than the general working population. And, there's all sorts of reasons for that. As you alluded to, we do tend to feel like we need to go it alone. We've been a bit independent, and it's kind of hard to get into more of that space of working with somebody else on personal things like that. Lots of people reflected on that, but also quite often you end up with somebody who feels a bit homophobic or transphobic or biphobic or whatever that may be. Somebody told me a tale of having a mentor who wouldn't be seen with them in public in case somebody thought they were on a date. So there's just like these ridiculous things that happen. And obviously, if you end up with that sort of mentor, it strips your confidence. It's not helpful. But quite often what we'll do is we'll then say, okay, danger, danger, let's not continue there. And one of the things that these leaders were encouraging us all to do is say, don't lose your nerve. Actually go and find somebody else who does understand you better, does have your best interests at heart. I think we need to be really conscious, because it's not like people talk that much. LGBTQ plus people are less likely to have mentors, even though that data is there. But I think that just being aware of that and some of the reasons for it means that you can sort it out. You don't have to miss out on that advantage.
And what about that kind of diversity of experiences within the spectrum of the community? So you mentioned as well sort of being out as a leader is very, very powerful. That's obviously easier for some than others, and you talk a little bit in the book about how particularly I, for example, have had a long-term partner since I was at university, and so I've always been able to just refer with she, her pronouns about my partner, and that's a really easy way that sort of, fits into the kind of heterosexual expectations of sort of, okay, you've got a partner, that's a gay way to live that's acceptable, if that sort of makes sense. But I'm sure it's very different for bisexual people who are maybe in a relationship with someone of the opposite gender at that time, or a trans person who's, depending on where they are in their sort of transition journey, or, I don't know, was there anything that emerged in terms of like what does it mean to come out, and what does that look like for people?
Yeah, and I take a similar approach to you. I whip the word wife into the conversation quite rapidly, because it's interesting. Lots of people raise this fact that there's a window when you go to a new role where you can mention that you have a wife or whatever is appropriate to your situation, and people will just accept it because they don't have a story about you yet. They've just met you. But you miss that window and it kind of closes, and suddenly people have just made this assumption that you are a heterosexual cisgender person. And one of the guys who's gay in the book referred to it as getting wifed, where people would just aggressively say, how's your wife, how's your wife? And then you're stuck in this situation where you're having to decide whether to just like lie overtly, or whether to just be really inauthentic and sort of standoffish by not engaging in the conversations, or whether to suddenly pronounce I am a gay and create this like awkward situation that might put you in some kind of danger sometimes. So ideally you would get that information in there quick as you can before people have made that assumption. And actually quite a lot of people find it helpful when they've moved office, like even within their same job, they might have some kind of different circumstance that they are working with a new team, and they use that opportunity to come out to the new team that don't have that story laid down, and then word filters back to their old team. Lots of people spoke about sometimes just having to tell people and change that story, and that's when it can be quite challenging. There's lots of different descriptions in the books of different things that can help you, and that sort of changing situation is one of those. Sometimes, did I just get really loud there? Sometimes, if you have a job where you have political protection, that can be helpful. Or perhaps you have diplomatic immunity to something and you have the opportunity to be out when other people aren't. And there's all these different opportunities, but certainly people spoke a lot about how it's awkward. For example, one of the people I interviewed was Jim Fitterling, who's the CEO of Dow, one of the Fortune 500 companies. And when he decided that he wanted to come out, and the story's in the book, but essentially he, one of the drivers of him coming out was that he'd been very unwell, and in coming back to the office, he was like, what are the things that I can remove that are really stressful in my life? And one of them was hiding this fact of him being gay. So he went to the staff group and discussed what the best way was. I think he was the chief operating officer at the time of Dow. And that staff group were able to support him to come out, and then, because obviously he had such a prominent position, he ended up doing it on coming out day to the whole company, many thousands of people. And, you know, when we were speaking of it, he said that he still gets messages all the time from people saying what a positive impact that had on them. Or, like, you know, they had a kid who came out and they would have thought differently about that and been upset, but because they'd seen that this successful, confident man had been able to do that, it changed their ability or their thoughts about their own kid. And I think that a lot of people who discussed how challenging it can sometimes be and how awkward and how stressful it can be to come out, a lot of the people said that there's this altruistic benefit in coming out, because when you come out, it makes it easier for other people to come out. And when you're in a position of certain privilege, then that is a really positive thing that you can do in the world, and people feel that they should do it even if it doesn't personally benefit them at the time.
That's really lovely. I've still got lots of questions of my own, but there's some starting to come in from online, and I wonder if people in the room have some questions. So I'd like to open up now. If got two at the back. Yep, go on then, straight at the back. Sorry, I'll take two in the back row, and then you go next, or the other way around.
Well, rather than a question, it was just sort of observation. I think I'm possibly I can still shout. I'm possibly the oldest person in the room, and I still work. I'm the co-chair of the Westminster LGBT Forum. But one of the things I was going to mention that I've experienced, and most of the time I've worked with it, done community-based work, so we have, you know, by its nature, quite an understanding environment. But I think one of the things that is a great virtue and aspect of being a member of our community is the importance, strength and depth of friendships, because they often, for people who, you know, might have a family, they possibly follow a slightly different route to ourselves. And I think also issues around retirement that, again, I think we probably see more people who reach retirement age and members of our community who may finish up doing some work around the very issues that the community face. So I think that's a kind of, you know, sort of positive aspect that comes from that and may possibly strengthen you, the individual, as being at work as well. So.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
And yeah, the popular gay author Armistead Maupin refers to, you know, you have your biological family, and then you have your logical family, which is, you know, sometimes when you are rejected by those people who may be related to you by blood, there's you know, this other family, these people who become really important to you, who spring up. It's actually a little bit in the book, because people reflect on when there are policies, for example, health policies. Quite often they're quite restrictive at work as to who they cover, and actually people haven't necessarily thought about how, for LGBTQ plus people, it might not be these really specific regimented relationships between people which are the most important people who you know, need to be covered by these policies, but actually need to be a bit more flexible about that.
I think not even rejected family, but I've found personally that, you know, in my personal life, I don't have any friends who have queer parents and have grown up in that family, but actually in a work environment, I've met people who are an older generation to me who are able to then, form those friendships and learn about what it means to create, a rainbow family in whatever form and still be a working professional who contributes to, life. So that can be a really lovely source of relationship, as you say. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And fellow. I was just curious of the sort of looking at the measure of using kind of like the FTSE 100 or the Fortune 500 as a measure, especially when sort of American universities are saying you've got like a 1 in 135,000 chance of becoming a CEO with a business degree. But especially because last year, the Raconteur Journal did some research based on the census in 2021 into CEOs, and they discovered that people in the role of CEO outside of those are better represented by the LGBTQ plus population than they are actually in the demographic of the population.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the information in the round, the focus of my book is what's stopping people getting to the upper echelons, sort of the top roles. So that is where my main focus is. It's also the case that there's a lot of diversity in this. You can't just, I used the Fortune 500 or the FTSE 100 or whatever as proxies of some of those extremely senior roles. But it is certainly the case that this is massively diverse depending on what sector you're in. So for example, if you look at customer-facing sectors, they tend to have a much more significant reflection of LGBTQ plus people, financial services, all those sorts of services. Whereas if you look at, for example, the oil and gas or the transport sector, they tend to have far, far, far lower. And there's all sorts of reasons for that, some of which I go into in the book. But yeah, you're right that this is not just a homogenous thing that is a rule for everyone. It varies by sector, it varies by country, it varies by what part of the LGBTQ plus spectrum that you may be on, and it's a complicated story. But having looked at the research and having spoken to all those people, the conclusion that I've reached is that in general we are less likely to be in the more senior roles. It's not to say that we can't get there, it's not to say that there aren't people there, and it's not to say that in certain settings we are overrepresented. Of course we are. This is a complex and diverse part of the world. But I think that overall it is the case that we are less well represented than we ought to be at these upper echelons of the profession. And I think that that's an interesting trend that we don't fully understand. So I think that what I've tried to do here is help shine a bit of light on why that might be.
Great. Good. Yeah.
I was wondering, you alluded in your comment just now to patterns you've noticed that might shape different experiences of your interviewees. I was wondering what patterns you alighted on. By that I mean, did you find other identities sort of shaped how their experience as someone who was LGBT sort of impacted them? It might be a racial identity, a class identity, and also it could be a pattern in terms of sector, which you just alluded to, that in some sectors, it worked a little bit more easily than in others. And so, yeah, I was just curious what those patterns were.
100%. I think the question of intersectionality was one that really interested a lot of people who I spoke to. Quite a lot of people who I spoke to were black or minority ethnicities. And they said, it's interesting because having more than one diverse characteristic, it sort of feels like you have to choose sometime. Like, am I going to relate to the fact that I'm black today, or the fact that I'm gay today, or whatever that may be, the fact that I'm a woman? And people actually got really into it with all sorts of other characteristics that have an impact on various experiences they have at work, that go all the way down to things like how tall or short you are, and all sorts of things that they see as having an impact on how they network, or how they're assessed, or how they're viewed at an interview. But I would say that black and minority ethnicity people probably had the most to say about this, and they said, it's really actually quite difficult because there tends to be support available that is that is around people's race or ethnicity, and there tends to be support available that's around people's gender and that's around people's LGBTQ plus status. But it's pretty rare that those things link together, and quite often actually they feel like they operate in quite separate silos. So people can feel quite disconnected. And in those situations, a lot of people reflected that there's obviously not a hierarchy of diversity, but the fact that if you are a black or minority ethnicity person, often, though obviously not always, that is something that is visible, that you can't hide. And people relate to that differently to something like being LGBTQ+, where actually it's not visible and you have to declare it in some way often in order for people to know about it. And that really affects people differently. Lots of them said, you know, if I was saying what was the one thing that impacted me most at work, it wouldn't be being LGBTQ+, it would be being Maori, or it would be being African American, or whatever people's characteristics were. But they did say that actually having those two things together, or three things, or four things, it lowers the ceiling. Those things combine, and you know, you've got your rainbow ceiling, you've got your glass ceiling, you've got various other ceilings, and you find yourself stuck quite low the more of those diverse characteristics you may end up accumulating. Obviously, it's not a scientific analysis, that one, but that's certainly a lot of people's experiences.
Thank you. I've got a couple online, and then I'll come back to the room. So sort of sticking with that thread of visibility, Lee has asked, you mentioned having political cover as being helpful, and what are your thoughts on recent comments about trying to block things like rainbow lanyards and staff networks that have come from the current government? Yeah, that kind of knocks the desire to be out open and about, Lee imagines. What do you think?
I mean, I think when it comes to visibility and supporting the rights of LGBTQ plus people, it goes in waves, doesn't it? And people will make various comments for the political moments of the day. And I would say a couple of things. One is that obviously using LGBTQ plus people's identities as a political football isn't good for anybody's mental health. And it can be something that is very stressful for organisations. But what we've seen when organisations have found themselves in difficulty is that perhaps what they've been doing is focusing on, say, doing something nice for Pride as something that they haven't fully thought about as an organisation. It's not embedded in their values. Perhaps it's being led by the marketing department and thinking this would be a good thing to do. It's something that people sometimes describe as rainbow washing. Or pink washing, where you're doing something that might make you look good as a company, but not necessarily doing something that is genuinely beneficial for your staff or customers who are LGBTQ+. And it often is the case that people who find themselves in more of a predicament, they've not got the full support of the company. It's not within the values of the company. So lots of the recommendations that some of the people in the book would give for that would be that make sure that the whole company's on board, all the way up to the CEO and the board. People understand why they're doing something. They're not just doing something for the sake of it and then getting themselves into a pickle. As for things like rainbow lanyards, I mean, I wouldn't want to wade into the political shenanigans that are going on at the moment, but it certainly is the case that there are lots of different ways to make people feel like they belong and they're included and they're valued and wanted at work. And in some cases, having some kind of visible representation of that can be really powerful. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Think about what is going to be the helpful, useful thing to do for your staff, for your customers, whoever you're trying to help, and make good decisions based on logic and values.
And Janet asks, what about globally, where you've got large organisations where employees are working remotely across the world, and there might be different legal and cultural complexities? What would you say about that?
Yeah, it's really difficult. There's a lot about that in the book, actually, because there's quite a few people. For example, I interviewed somebody who worked at it was Facebook at the time in Singapore, and had worked in other companies that were international, and would reflect on a culture that was created at headquarters, and then perhaps that same culture was assumed to permeate throughout the whole of the world, but that wasn't always necessarily the case. And then people reflecting on working in local companies versus international companies, and the different expectations of equality that would be there, that would actually raise their expectations for when they went to work in more local companies. But yeah, no organisation, no company is going to break the law in a country that they're in. It's their prerogative to operate within the laws and rules of that country. That said, as people coming from different cultures and concepts, they have the opportunity to work within that, to create a more inclusive and supportive environment for people. For example, when I used to be a diplomat's wife, my wife was a diplomat in Washington and Tokyo, and in both of those places, when I moved there, same-sex marriage was not recognised at a national level, but the embassy had been able to have those conversations with the host government to get me a family visa, to get me the ability to work in those countries. So there are sometimes useful things that can be done by companies to help the people that they want to send out to those countries to be able to be safe, to be able to have whatever rights are available within the constraints of what that country ought to be. And I think it's quite powerful. I remember being at Tokyo Pride, and there was this little queue of people who were Japanese who were coming up, and they said, "We've heard that there's somebody here that, you know, the government has recognised them as some kind of family status because they're a lesbian, and we want to know if it's true." And I'm like, "Yes, it's true." And they're like, can we see the visa? They were genuinely excited about that. And obviously, you know, nobody's trying to change another country, but by finding the opportunities to support their staff in whatever way is suitable and appropriate, it can make a significant difference. And it can affect the culture. You're in control of the culture within your organisation, wherever it is in the world, and you have that opportunity. I heard stories of people who actually were out at work and would go back in at the end of the day. Or, trans people who would feel able to express that gender at work and then would change when they were going home. The workplace doesn't always have to be somewhere where things are negative. Actually, you can create this really supportive environment where people can thrive in ways that they might not be able to do in other parts of their life.
Lovely. The Tokyo Pride sounds amazing. Back to the room. Did you have a question still? Yeah.
Thank you. I was going to talk about the rainbow lanyards, but that's been covered now. So,
okay.
I know intersectionality has kind of already been mentioned, and I think what's really important, we've got 2 women up on the stage as well. When it comes to breaking the rainbow ceiling, there's also that breaking of the glass ceiling as well, where there's a lot of issues around female leaders in these really big, important places that you've mentioned. And how do you think being lesbian or how we've also got trans feminine people as well. How do you think those kind of issues would affect perhaps drive to kind of attain these important positions?
Yeah, it's so important. There's lots of really nice stories in the book from Inga Beale, who was CEO of Lloyd's of London, and she's a bisexual woman, and she has a lot of reflections in the book about how when it wasn't necessary to come out, she hesitated to do it because she knew that it was already really, really difficult to be a woman in those really senior roles in the finance sector. And she was already, she was being a role model for women. She was working really hard against all, the things that we all know about that affect that particular glass ceiling. And she thought, gosh, do I really want to add something extra to this that's going to, cause further challenges to me? And she tells the tale of being asked to be on one of those recognition lists that go around where the top X number of people in this business are LGBTQ+. These lists are really nice, actually, for showing a bit of visible role models where they might otherwise be invisible. But she, when she was asked to be on that list, she hesitated because of that exact reason. And she was like, goodness, I'm just bringing extra drama upon myself. And then she, reflected on these things and thought, actually, it's really important to be that visible role model for that can help other people. But you're right. The more characteristics you have that hold you down from getting to the place that you would like to be, I mean, the more challenging it is and the more you don't necessarily want to layer extra challenges on top of that. So yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's a bit of an act of faith for us, isn't it, to be out, because we know that sure it will give us some advantages, it will also give us some disadvantages, and actually we need to be aware of those, and we need to maybe work that bit extra harder. So yeah, there's not an easy answer to any of this, but I think yeah, it's an important question.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Angelina Lian. I speak about intersectionality and allyship in the workplace, mainly to corporate organizations, some of who you have mentioned in your book. And I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for doing this work. Thank you for doing the research. Often when I do these talks, like, people always say, do you have any resources to recommend or anything? And I'd happily, after reading your book, I'd happily recommend it in my talks. But yeah, I just wanted to say I feel really seen that you've done this work. There's lots of people who at the moment who identify as LGBTQ+ and feel like it's a very challenging time at the moment. So for people to keep doing more and more and more for inclusion for us, it's really nice. Thank you.
Make me
Lovely.
want to cry.
It's lovely. Thank you. Thank you. I think I might use Chair's prerogative and just ask you one last question, because we've only got a couple minutes left. So kind of in that vein, a bit cheesy, but what career advice would you give your younger self?
At the end of this book, there's a letter to your younger self where I brought together the advice of everyone who I interviewed into a letter of advice. But like, what advice would I give? I mean, I think I would just say, you should probably just come out and get on with it, and and really focus on what you want to achieve in your life, because having it as a secret, it just creates drama and stress and gossip and anxiety in your life. And certainly there are pros and cons to coming out, but like, if you can just go out there and be confident, it will make a difference to you, and it will make a difference to other people. And when I first came out in different office settings, and then I saw that within the next couple of months, all these other people started to come out who'd never felt that they were able to before. I guess that my advice would be aware of your shadow, because actually you can have quite a positive impact in the world and help people if you're just a little bit brave.
Lovely. Thank you. And yeah, I really echo the sentiments as well. Like, thank you. Really, really lovely. All right, well, thank you so much. It's been a fantastic session. We're going to have to wrap up now, I'm afraid, but I'm sure you'd be happy to chat to people a little bit afterwards if you're sticking around.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, I shouldn't speak for what you're there. And to everyone watching online, thank you so much for joining us as well, and you can continue the conversation on Circle as well. And very welcome to get in touch with me, and I'd be very interested in hearing more thoughts from people. So you'll find the links online to buy the excellent and highly recommended Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling book, of course. And if you're in the room, there's copies at the back that you can buy with the author signed them. So do stick around. And yeah, a massive thank you to you, Layla.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's so lovely to meet you all.
It's been brilliant. So yeah, thank you, everyone.